Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Charlotte. Well, as she said, my name is Adam Brown, and I work here with Revolution Prep in the Austin and San Antonio area. I'm excited to be with you here today. College admissions testing is something that I'm really passionate about because of the importance of it. And so I'm excited about talking with you today about the PSAT, but not just that test, but how that process plays out for you down the road over the next 2 to 3 years, and how you can help set yourself up to be successful in getting into the college that you would like to go to in a few years. So, a little bit about me to start off. My name is Adam Brown, like I said. I actually grew up quite a ways from here, though, in Pennsylvania. Went to school in Chicago and then became a high school English teacher after graduation. Did that for several years, and one thing that I saw was just how important college admissions testing was in students having the opportunity to go where they wanted. So when I had the chance to jump on with Revolution Prep and help make that something that students could achieve and really get that opportunity that they were longing for, I jumped at it. So I've been doing that several years. This is one of my favorite parts of my job, getting to come speak with you in presentations like this. And I'm hoping I can definitely help you out with the PSAT, with your score report, and with the next couple years understanding what are the next steps that you need to be taking. If you have any questions, that's what I'm here for. I want to make sure to answer those. But to make sure we get through the presentation, I want to hold those for the end. So please write those down. We'll have time for questions and answers at the end. And hopefully I can help answer any questions that you have following the presentation. To give you a little roadmap of what we're going to get into today, obviously the first thing is, why does this test matter? Or testing as a whole, why is it important when we look at the college admissions process? We're also going to look at the PSAT results that many of you brought with you tonight. We're going to look at what do those numbers mean and how do you take those numbers and move into the next phases with the SAT, the ACT, or other SAT subject tests even that you're going to get into down the road. Finally, we'll close out with making sure you see the timeline of what things you can be doing to set your child up for a more successful experience and a more higher likelihood of getting into the college that they are interested in. Now, the first part, like we talked about, why does testing matter? Why did I choose to step out of the classroom to move into this arena, and why is it just so significant? If we look here, we have a couple of charts up here, and this looks at a breakdown of what college admissions counselors are going to look at. Now, when we look at that first pie on your left, the big output, what do we notice being by far the largest section, the biggest impact of what college admissions counselors looked at? Right, your transcript. And what percent approximately would you say that is? Right, 50%. And that makes sense, right? You spend all that time, all of that working on it, and that's obviously going to be a big impact. With that transcript, obviously the biggest thing that the counselor is going to look at is your GPA. But there's a lot of other stuff that also factors into that students do need to be aware of. What type of courses the student took, whether they were honors, AP, whether there was a certain concentration that student brought. Counselors want to see how that student has been basically trying to expand their knowledge and push themselves during their high school time, because that's what college will be. So that's another big factor that will play into that transcript. Now, like we said, that is going to be about 50% of that process. But as far as the actual hours, I want us to also see how many hours we put into that. So within a certain day, look at the time you're in class, the time you're doing homework, the time you're studying. If you took all that in one day, about how many hours would you say you spend per day on that? Around 10 hours, about 7 hours, maybe 8 to 10 hours. So let's just say 10 hours per day. You do that 5 times a week, correct? So we're up to 50 hours a week. How many weeks of the year would you say you're in school approximately? Okay, around 40, we'll say. So 50 times 40. Who's the math genius in here who can help us out? How many hours a year are you spending on that transcript part? Right, 2,000. And then you do that over the course of 4 years, and you're going to be looking at about 8,000 hours. And that makes sense. It's a lot of hours to be spending, but this is going to be about half of the entire consideration for whether you get into that college that you want to go to. Now, there are 2 other pieces, though, that we want to look at. First, let's look at the other elements that go into the actual application. What kind of things do you think go into the application beyond just your transcript? Great. Your essay, references, right? Okay, and those things are all going to play upon the things you've done outside the classroom, correct? How many people here play a sport? Great. How about something involved with music? Okay, volunteer work. Anyone do that? Great. So there's a variety of ways that you're kind of trying to show yourself to be a well-rounded person to fill out the rest of that application. And when you think of that, for someone that plays sports here, who's on the football team? Okay. How many hours would you say you spend a day either on the field with practice or games or anything like that? About 2 to 3 hours. Okay, so if you're involved in 2 to 3 hours a day, do that 5 days a week, right? Let's say 10 hours a week. If you do that, once again, 40 weeks out of the year, about 400 hours times 4, and you're looking at about 1,600 hours. So we're looking at obviously something closer to about half of what we would see out of the transcript, but still a sizable chunk going into the rest of that application. The final piece is this standardized testing. And looking at that, it looks like standardized testing makes about how much? Yeah, a little over 25%. 25 to 30% of the entire consideration process by the counselor will be based upon your standardized test. Now, with that, how many hours do you think on average a student spends on standardized? And you can see up here, it's kind of give it away, right? But only how many? 10 hours. Now, why is that surprising? Right, it's not proportionate. If you actually set standardized testing proportionate, even if you took it times 2 to make it equivalent to the transcript, you would have students basically spending, and you ended up looking at about 20 hours of prep then compared to that 8,000. You're still looking at just one for every 400 minutes that someone's spending on the transcript, on their actual academics. They're only spending 1 minute on test prep. It's obviously not that amount that we would look at. And when you think about it logically, it's something that we would expect to see something proportionate because of the value. Now, the good news is that's something that you absolutely can still change. You can look ahead. You're only on the PSAT, and you can start to dig into how can I prepare. And at the end, we'll talk about the different options because there are quite a few out there for you. But the important point to understand here is that standardized tests do matter. They are important in that college admissions process. And most importantly, there are things you can do to help increase the likelihood of getting into college based upon these standardized tests. It's one of only 3 pieces, but it is an important component and one that we want to make sure you're setting yourself up as well as possible for. Now, the second part that we said we were going to dig into today is the question of what is the PSAT. Now, basically, if we want to think of the actual acronym here, it's a practice version of the SAT, and that really is applicable to this because the PSAT has many elements that are very similar, we'll see coming up here, to the actual SAT. Now, there's also something really important for you, not just prepping for the SAT in the content, but in the sense of college admissions testing as a whole. It's a very unique type of testing, and so for many of you, especially those of you who are sophomores, this is going to be your first exposure to this type of testing. One of the biggest elements of it is these tests are long and exhausting. They're meant to be that way. That's one of the things they're checking. And for many of you, this is the longest test that you've taken. That's okay. If that's the way you felt during it, that's all right. But that's one of the things that you want to be recognized, and we'll talk about that on the next slide. If you're a junior, you would have taken this already a year before, but the added element that comes into play for you is that this now can qualify you for the National Merit Scholarship Program. Obviously, this is a very prestigious award that can really open up a lot of opportunities, not just in admissions, but also on the scholarship side of things. And finally, for everyone to realize, this is a chance for you to find out, most importantly, where you stand so that you can know how to prepare effectively for the real SAT. Because like we talked about, that piece is going to play a big role in the process of the consideration for the counselors when they're looking over your application. Now, to look a little bit at the breakdown here, as you were looking at the exam, I don't know how many of you might have been looking at that clock, but the total time from when you sat down and got started to the time when you finished with bubbling in your names and doing all of that was probably going to end up being around 2.5 hours. But there were only going to be 5 sections that you were focusing on here. Now, we look here, that breaks down into 3 areas. What's one of the areas? Great, critical reading. A second area? Math. And finally, you had writing. Now, did you actually do any concrete writing for this? No, we're going to see later that's actually one of the biggest differences between the PSAT and the SAT, but you did do something that worked with your ability to understand writing rules and how that factors in. one of the biggest things that you really need to be noticing here is how did this length of a test feel for you? We're looking at a test that's 2.5 hours basically from start to finish with the breaks, with the time before, all of that. That's, for many of you, raise your hand if that's the longest test you've ever taken. Hey, so more than half. That's a big thing, and that's something that you need to be registering. How much did exhaustion play a role for you? Did you feel like at the end it was tougher for you to pay attention? If so, these are things that you're really going to want to be thinking about, because I'll tell you what, these college admissions tests, when you get up to the SAT and ACT, they actually get even longer, and so this endurance aspect really does come into play. Now, I want everyone to get out their PSAT score report. I see many of you holding them excitedly, waiting for us to get to this piece. And it is a really important part. We want to make sure that we understand how do we interpret these score reports correctly. Now, we talked about there are 3 areas basically that it breaks down. Although there are 5 sections, there are 3 content areas that are going to be analyzed by the PSAT exam. The first is critical reading, the second mathematics, and third is writing skills. In each of those areas, you get a score that is going to range from 20 to 80. Now, if you have 3 sections with a maximum of 80 points on each section, and they add these up to get your total score, what's your total possible score for the entire exam? Right, 240. But for each section, you're going to get a micro score out of that. So 20 to 80, and add those 3 up to end up with a 240. Now, that's not the only piece that you need to look at, though. You also need to look right below that. You're going to see what is known as the score range. Now, that's not the range of the actual score you actually received on the PSAT, but what it does is gives an indication of what range you could expect on the PSAT if you took it again without any kind of additional preparation. Now, I think that last part is so important, without additional preparation, because there are things that you can do to help yourself if you're a sophomore, to help yourself improve on it for the next time. But you also should recognize there is an inherent range in this. There are factors that come into play with how you do on test day that we need to be aware of, and we need to be making sure we're setting ourselves up to be successful with. The final piece that we see underneath that is going to be the percentile rank. And the percentile rank is just going to give you a chance to see how you stand in comparison to all the other students who took this exam nationally. Now, for you, what you need to worry about is getting into the college that you want to go to. But this is helpful in understanding, if you understand where your college lies as far as the level of competitiveness for admissions, understanding where you stand in relation to other applicants is something that's really going to be valuable to know. And so this helps you understand that piece as well. Finally, the piece that you look at here on your score report is the selection index. Now, that's just a fancy college admissions testing way of saying your total score. Like we talked about, your total score can be a maximum of how many points? Right, 240. So they take your 3 sections, add those up, and with that, they're able to determine your selection index, or your total aggregate score. Now, with that percentile, once again, it's going to compare your overall score to other students. Now, a big thing that many of you may be wondering is, obviously, when you get to the actual college application, you're not going to be writing down your PSAT score as the admission score. What you're going to be putting is your SAT or ACT. And if you want to get a feel for what kind of SAT could you expect if you correlated that to the PSAT, just add a 0. Simple as that. One of the only things about this whole process that I think is actually straightforward and easy to understand, and that is you simply add a 0. So in this sample right here, the student had a 146, so add that 0, and you can see the student ends up with a 1460 as an expected SAT score now. One thing to keep in mind, though, we talked about the range. Because of that, can you be 100% sure that what you'll get on that SAT is going to be a 1460? No, it all is going to depend on how much you prepare for it, how much time you put in, the sleep you get the night before. There are things that you'll do to hopefully put yourself towards the higher end of that range. But if we do things and don't prepare, we could obviously expect that maybe our score might drop depending on the day. So there's a range, but this is what we would expect as a average, or most consistently, what students would get without any preparation. And then another piece that's really important is the skills breakdown. I think this is something not to overlook. as you see here, one of the things that's so valuable is it gives you a breakdown to understand not just within writing or reading or math, how do you do as a whole, but within specific skill areas of these sections, how do you perform? Are there certain areas that you're really strong in, but certain areas that are actually what were keeping you down several points? It's not going to be something as simple as good at reading, bad at math. There are certain elements of each that you could be stronger or need more improvement in. And this is something that you really want to take closely because you can see where are the areas that I can find the greatest improvement. You'll also notice that you have a code that's specific to you. When you log in to the PSAT website, you actually can use that to see your answers to every question on the test. And that's something that can even go deeper into how were you doing with these questions, and were these questions that you knew the answer to and just slipped up on, or questions that you actually had a hard time with the content for. That's an important piece of information to know, so I'd encourage you, use that code to really go in and look closely at your results as we see here on this question by question breakdown. Now, the next piece we really want to dig into is converting this PSAT to the SAT. How is it different? How is it similar? And what can we really expect on the SAT in comparison to the PSAT? Now, over 95% of the content, like we said, it's a practice SAT. 95% of it is going to be the same type of content. You're going to have reading, math, and writing. But the three differences are going to be this. Number one, the SAT is what? Right, slightly harder. It's going to be a little more difficult, which is understandable considering they expect students to be taking this a little farther on in their educational process. Second, the SAT has a 25-minute essay. We talked about this, right? The writing for the PSAT was not necessarily involving you doing the writing, but you critiquing and analyzing writing that you saw already there. Learning how to do your own essay is an important part of the college process, and so that's something they're checking. And finally, a really big piece here, the SAT is much longer. We're talking 4 hours long total. That's a long test, so it's really important that we understand we need to get that endurance aspect up even more if we're going to be successful when we're stepping in to the SAT exam.